An alien told him, in a voice that bypassed words and landed like a stone in the chest, that their home was cataloged as 3-Eye Atlas, and that the monuments we call pyramids were never tombs, but an instruction manual left in stone and sound. That sentence alone would have been enough to end Dennis Reeves's career twice over had he spoken it in the halls of the university. What made it impossible to dismiss was the way he said it afterward, not as a thesis or a theory, but as a memory that burned him from the inside. I first met Dennis over coffee in a strip mall diner in Tempe, months after the night he swore changed him. He was 60, graying at the temples, posture pulled a little inward from a lifetime of reading big stones and bigger arguments. He carried his disappointment the way some people carry scars, visible only if you looked closely. They called their home 3-Eye Atlas, he told me without preamble, and the way he said it was neither boastful nor theatrical. It was tired and relieved, like a man who had been carrying a secret for 40 years and at last could lay it down. Dennis had the credentials: a PhD in Egyptology, a decade teaching introductory courses at a respected university, papers that once earned him a polite, if skeptical, hearing. But he also had a conviction that put him on a collision course with the mainstream. He believed, and had been arguing, in a small, stubborn way for years, that the pyramids were built as living systems, not tombs. That belief cost him tenure, then funding, then the goodwill of colleagues who preferred the comfort of ossified explanations. For 2 decades, he oscillated between academic isolation and the online world's hunger for bold narratives. He became, as he liked to say in darker moments, the archaeologist nobody wanted to teach. That backstory matters. It gives the visitation a shape you can touch. A man who had been disbelieved for half his life is not the same man who is suddenly visited. He is primed, raw, ready to grasp anything that might prove him right. But this was never about vindication for Dennis. This was about an encounter that rearranged the axis of his life. Tempe, the night of the visitation, was hot in that dry Arizona way that leaves the air a physical thing. Dennis's apartment was a single-room testimony to a life lived between books and receipts, stacks of journals, a battered field notebook, a couch that had seen better decades. He had been sitting in front of the TV, not watching, so much as using the screen as a companion, an old habit. That's where the small miracle, the event that changed his trajectory, began. A light, nothing like any streetlight or car headlamp, a cool blue that pooled against his blinds and moved with intention. He told me how the light came in like a thought, clean and urgent. The lights in the street flickered. His dog, an old terrier named Mino, whimpered and tucked his head into Dennis's lap. Dennis, who had spent much of his professional life translating stone for a skeptical ear, felt words appear inside his mind before any sound reached his ears. He described the voice as if it were a hand on his shoulder. Not large, not oppressive, simply there, precise and almost clinical in its intent. "We are observers," the presence said. "We catalog, we awaken. We have been called many names." That was the first contact. It was the kind of thing people either write off as a hallucination or hold as the origin of their rebirth. Dennis believed. He hadn't always. He told me he had tested himself in every imaginable inward way over the following days. Was he dehydrated, sleep-deprived, grieving some loss he had buried? He checked his medication. He measured his timeline against the night sky. He reviewed security camera footage. No footage showed anything that could be called a spacecraft. He even left the apartment for a week to see if distance changed memory. Nothing diluted the impression. If anything, the experience gained density, like an etching in metal darkening with age. The presence named itself as affiliated with a line of watchers that, in the voice Dennis received, had once been known to the people of that ancient river as the Anunnaki. That name he already knew. It was part of a contentious, messy corpus of ancient astronaut lore. What he did not expect, and what the presence offered like a turned key, was context. According to the visitor, their culture, or at least their archival network, was cataloged under a designation humans had not used, a cold administrative moniker that sounded like coordinates and organization at once, 3i/Atlas. The alien speaks in present tense. "We are record and resonance," it said to him. "Our home is cataloged 3i/Atlas. We are catalogers and custodians. We seeded not to possess, but to encode." He said seeded, Dennis told me, and his hands moved in a way that suggested he was still rehearsing the sound of it, a scientist trying to translate a foreign datum. But not in the way popular books make it feel, not a takeover, an encoding, a map. Everything that followed, he insisted, was offered as a kind of guided projection. Consciousness moved forward and backward across time. If you want to explain it in symbol terms, he said, think of it like a remote viewing exercise, except the remote you access is an archive preserved in architecture and frequency, and the archive answers when you have the right key. That key, the voice said, was resonance, sound, shape, and alignment. Before my voice recounts more, one small thing. If this kind of story draws you in, if you want to see more of these hidden or overlooked narratives, subscribe below. There, a single quiet invitation, and then the story picks up again. What happened next is hard to render without sounding like a believer who has lost his critical faculties, which Dennis was not. He was meticulous in his descriptions, because that was his temperament, and because the visions, as he described them, had an internal logic that demanded it. The visitor offered him 3 layered views of Egypt, not simply different eras, but different operational states of a system. First, the construction layer, an Egypt before weathering, before tomb robbers and sandstorms had erased the intent of stone. Dennis saw machines that looked like scaffolding, but were not scaffolds in our sense. They were arrays of suspended crystalline assemblies that hummed at frequencies he later associated with the number 432, a harmonic some musical theorists hold as significant. The voice did not insist on numerical dogma. It offered resonance as a method. Vibrations tuned to particular intervals, channeled through capstones and polished cladding, focused into standing waves. In Dennis's description, the pyramids were less feats of brute lifting and more feats of alignment, with the sky, with the planet's subtle magnetic idiosyncrasies, and with an external vector tied in the voice's terms to 3i Atlas. I say he saw because that is the honest, essential qualifier. The construction scene arrived to him as vision, not as physical travel. He could not smell the limestone dust, he could not touch the ropes, but the images had texture. The shimmer of copper and torchlight, the cold flash of crystal faces, the low mechanical song that made hair on the back of his neck stand up. The visitor spoke through him, placing pieces of explanation between images as a curator might annotate a museum exhibit. "We aligned our architecture with the stars," the presence said, "not to bow to gods, but to code a pattern. The capstone is a node. The cladding is a lens. The chambers breathe if the circuit is complete." Node, lens, breathe, I remember Dennis repeating. His field notebook later had sketches, crude for someone used to working with measured diagrams, but telling in their earnestness. He drew concentric circles, vectors pointing to Orion, a schematic of a capstone filled with crystal. He traced lines back to a term he had heard in the voice, archive. Second came the Golden Age, the temples and sarcophagi used as initiation chambers where the living were guided through processes that touch DNA, what the visitor described as the activation of the pineal and the uncoiling of kundalini. The voice did not use our spiritual vocabulary as certainties. Rather, it framed them as functional descriptors. Pineal as receptor, kundalini as channel, DNA as a record that could be tuned. To the alien, the language of our mystics was a set of protocols written in flesh. Dennis told me the initiation scenes with a mix of awe and careful distance. He described pharaohs who entered chambers not to die, but to be made, initiated into the living archive. They lay in stone hollows that were, the voice insisted, wombs of resonance. The ritual was precise. A sequence of tones, a placement of crystal on the brow and at the base of the spine, a visual code read from carved symbols that acted like keys. The voice. An individual is a resonant node. To move the node is to open memory. What you call resurrection is resynchronization. Dennis's language shifted in those moments. He used the vocabulary of a scientist, terms like frequency modulation, resonant coupling, signal attenuation, and then folded in the language of devotion. The initiates were terrified, he said, and ecstatic, often at once. There was no attempt to convert. The visitor's teaching, as Dennis experienced it, functioned like a surgical light illuminating a body's hidden architecture. Third, and most distressing to those who would later attempt to debunk him, was the present day. A layer where the system, damaged by time and deliberate obfuscation, still functioned in broken ways. Some circuits remained live. Some visitors, in certain conditions, reported flashes of awakening, déjà vu, sudden clarity, spontaneous visions, an unshakable feeling of being called. Dennis had, since the visitation, met a handful of people who told him they had experienced such things at sites in Egypt. He was careful to say, reported, to avoid making it sound like a wave of global miracles. Some report, he would say, as if to protect the integrity of his own credibility. Throughout all three layers, the visitor kept returning to one phrase: archive and activation. This was their program, in the mind that interfaced with Dennis, to implant a durable, planetary-scale archive that could be accessed by organic minds when their resonance matched the code. It was not, the presence insisted, about dominance, but about a plan for continuity. We did not impose, it told him. We encoded, we prepared. The code waits for those who can receive it. That sentence, the coded waiting, was the hinge of the whole encounter. It reoriented Dennis's grief over his ostracism into something else: urgency. If there existed, in stone and sound, a legacy waiting for reception, then the problem was not merely proving to a council of colleagues that pyramids were more than mortuary architecture. The problem was restoring the conditions for reception. Even as he told me these things, Dennis drew a line under the ethical implications. He had no appetite for manna-like promises. He kept insisting, I remember, that this knowledge was delicate. The voice agreed. There were rules, the presence said, and those rules, transmitted in a series of images and short declarative phrases, read like an instruction manual written for guardians rather than conquerors. Preserve, unlock with consent, teach slowly, integrate the inner and outer. You can see why some institutions were hostile. The notion that sacred monuments hold operational knowledge unsettles the neat categories of archaeology and religion. It suggests a living technology embedded in culture, one that asks the living to change. Dennis's life had been predicated on careful reading of data. Now his data were subjective experience and testimonies. He became, overnight, both a schism and a bridge. There is another kind of detail about that first visitation I need to record because it shapes everything the voice later showed him: the alien's bearing. It did not appear as a caricature from Pulp Fiction. It presented as an observer, slender, reflective, like a being of glass and bone, but not humanoid in any easy way. More importantly, it communicated telepathically with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Its cadence was slow, the way someone speaking to a patient learner might be. When it spoke about 3-Eye Atlas, for instance, the phrase landed with administrative coolness rather than stentorian cosmic drama. 3-Eye Atlas is classification, the visitor said. It is archive and vector. We are part of the lineage you called Anunnaki. Our system classifies worlds and seeds potential. Earth was one of many. He repeated that to me: classification, archive, vector. And when I asked him to explain what he meant by vector, his fingers traced a line across the tabletop as if drawing current through the air. A direction, he said, a path of influence that is non-coercive. The archive is not a library you visit, it is a condition you enter. This idea that an archive could be a condition rather than a location is the conceptual key Dennis carried forward into his public work. It reframes monuments from static objects into devices within a field. That shift is subtle in discourse but enormous in practice. If a monument is a node in a field, then to engage it is less about excavation and more about attunement. After the visitation, Dennis did not rush to Egypt. He did not immediately buy a plane ticket or storm an archaeological dig. He had learned to be cautious about making claims, especially extraordinary ones. Instead, he journaled obsessively. He cross-referenced the images and tones the voice had given him with texts he had studied for decades: hymn fragments, ritual instructions, architectural plans. He wrote notes in the margins of ancient translations with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred scripture or a carefully preserved ledger. The voice cautioned him about attention and timing. You must be ready, it said. The archive attunes to readiness as much to technique. The signal is not merely out there, it is negotiated between the monument and the living. That negotiation is precisely why, according to the visitor, certain civilizations preserved pathways to ascend, not to create priests of power, but to create citizens capable of carrying an inner map. I want to be clear about Dennis's psychology here, because the line between wonder and delusion can be thin, and he was not a man given to mystical flights. He remained analytical to the core. He tested his experience against external records, sought corroboration, and found fragments. A passage in a temple inscription that, when translated in a particular light, read like an instruction to align a chamber at a certain time of night. A local oral history that recounted ceremonies where priests lay in stone cavities. A cluster of modern reports from travelers who spoke of inexplicable calm and audio experience inside certain temples. None of these proved the visitation as objective truth. They provided, at most, context, resonance, and a series of synonyms for the experience he could not dislodge. But it was not only texts and testimonies that changed him. There was the physical aftermath. Dennis said that for weeks after the encounter he slept differently. He dreamed in schematic diagrams. He woke with sense of lotus and copper. Small physiological changes that he framed cautiously. An increased sensitivity to sound, an almost painful awareness of low-frequency hums accompanied his new sense of mission. He never used the language of miracle to describe these, and he was careful when speaking about others' experiences to say reported or claimed. But the visceral quality of his description made the idea impossible to dismiss as purely metaphor. His response was methodical. He started a blog, not as a platform for sensational declarations, but as a field journal. He posted translations, sketches of chamber geometry, personal reflections on resonance. The blog attracted a few curious readers, then a handful of earnest ones: seekers, students, amateur historians. Over time, a small community formed around his careful, even-handed presentation of extraordinary claims. They were not a movement, at least not yet, but a network of people willing to listen and to do inner work while also following trace evidence. That network became the bridge between Dennis and the physical world of pilgrimage. When he finally traveled to Egypt months later, it was as a man bringing experiments rather than as a prophet coming to be crowned. He visited sites legally, submitted to the constraints of archaeological practice, did not attempt to enter sealed chambers illicitly, and avoided the kinds of rituals the visitor had warned him about without full preparation. His first visits were observational, notes and recordings, and interviews with local guides and workers. But in the dark of one of those nights, in the hush of a temple courtyard, he felt again the hum, faint, like a memory waking. It is worth pausing to note how the alien framed the Nile. To Dennis, the river emerged in the vision as less a geographic feature and more a programmable medium. The visitor described water as an information carrier. Currents could be modulated to carry patterns. The flood cycle could be shaped into a cyclical broadcast of seasonal resonance. The voice tied Nile-based ceremonies and temple placements into a system that used water, stone, and sky in a coordinated way. Water as medium. We used rivers to transmit, the visitor said. Water carries pattern, pattern carries memory. Dennis's reported experience of the Nile in the flesh, the scent of wet mud, the way the water pressings made a different kind of sound at night, became, for him, a literal confirmation of something he had seen in the vision. Again, reported, experienced, not proven. He understood the boundary between the three. As his confidence grew, so did his risk. Word spread in small circles. Some academics dismissed him politely in notes that read like well-intentioned rebukes. Methodologically insufficient, read one. Some fringe websites lionized him. Some seekers turned to him for initiation. He refused to perform as a guru. He argued with people, privately and publicly, about the ethics of making sacred protocols into spectacles. He was mindful of the visitor's injunctions. Integrate slowly, teach ethically, respect the archive. It was in that tension, between a desire to share a powerful experience and a need to guard against its misuse, that Dennis's mission took shape. He decided to become a translator of sorts, not a herald of cosmic truths, but a careful interpreter of what the visitor had said and shown. This humility attracted certain kinds of followers and repelled others, but it also allowed him to keep the work anchored to practice rather than fantasy. The night he first described hearing the name 3I Atlas in public, at a small lecture he gave to a handful of students and seekers in a community center, the room crackled with a peculiar mix of skepticism and hunger. He gave the talk as he gave everything now, with rigorous notes and candid qualifiers. The visitor called their archive 3I Atlas, he said, and I offer that only as what I was shown. If it resonates for you, excellent. If not, walk away. That transparency earned him more respect than the brashest frauds ever could. The lead-in at that talk was the same claim that drew me to him, that the pyramids were not burial complexes, but devices meant to awaken. When she asked, a woman in the back raised her hand and asked gently, "Are you saying we can turn ourselves on like a radio?" He smiled then, a tired, sad thing. "Not like a radio," he said. "More like tuning a harp while seated inside an echo chamber." The metaphor pleased him. It also underscored the difficulty. Tuning a harp implies practice, skill, and an instrument that can be broken if struck carelessly. It was around this time that Dennis began to collect stories of other people who claimed to have experienced odd clarity in Egyptian sites. A tour guide who sometimes led night walks told him of a tourist who began sobbing in the Hall of Records and could not explain why. A researcher passed along a 19th century travel diary where a colonial engineer made note of a low, continuous hum that seemed to emanate from buried structures. None of these pieces were proof, they were threads, accumulation of anecdote that, to Dennis, suggested a pattern. Meanwhile, the visitor continued to show him images and to drop thin, surgical teachings into his mind. The alien syntax in those moments was formal, intimate, and direct. We catalog and we wait. We encoded a path. We left a message not as commandment, but as invitation. 3I Atlas is both origin and instruction. The stones are a memory device. The waters carry timing. In those teachings, the visitor enumerated, in language Dennis later reduced to 5 core truths, a map that made sense only if you accepted a universe where consciousness could be both source and substrate. I will not list those truths now as doctrine. Dennis relayed them to me as part of the vision he received. That consciousness is persistent, that mind shapes matter in ways that are not fully measured by our instruments, that there are lineages of being reflected in our genes, the alien framed this as sequences rather than as a literal blood story, that inner power is latent and requires activation, and that evolution can be design or guidance rather than mere happenstance. Each of these claims, he always cautioned, should be read in the context of the visitor said rather than as affirmation. When the voice spoke of genes, Dennis emphasized the qualifier. The alien claimed humans contain sequences of external origin, presented here as part of the vision, a formulation he insisted upon because he was painfully aware of how such a claim could be misconstrued. He would walk for hours through local bazaars in Cairo, translating the risk in his head: truth that heals versus myth that harms. He kept the moral center intact by refusing to reduce the visitor's message to sensationalist headlines. There is one final piece of the visitation's texture that shaped Dennis more than anything else: the sense that what he had been shown was fragile. The visitor did not offer power without constraint. It warned of misuse, of arrogance, of people who would take the archive and turn it into a weapon. That ethical caveat haunted Dennis more than the marvels he had witnessed. It is one thing to be told you are right about the function of monuments. It is another to be given an enormous, ambiguous responsibility without a clear roadmap for stewardship. After that initial contact, Dennis spent months in what he called a phased response. He read, he listened, he reached out to a few trusted friends, and he learned to say, publicly, that he had experienced something unusual. He learned to bracket the language, always, according to the visitor, as I was shown, reported to me. That grammatical humility protected him in a world eager for certainties. And yet, there was a magnetism in the belief that both frightened and energized him. If 3I Atlas represented a lineage that had encoded a path into the planet, then awakening that path would require not just scholarly proof, but a kind of cultural readiness. That readiness, the visitor suggested, was not primarily technological, but ethical and inner. The monuments would not submit to amateurs. The archive required people who could hold the knowledge without becoming predatory. Dennis's notebooks from this period are a curious blend of field notes and confessional. He drew schematics and then wrote one-line reminders to himself. Teach slowly, no spectacle. Protect seekers, no trespass. The human, the scholar, and the steward were all negotiating in his head. The last thing he told me before the visitation narrative moved into the visions proper was that the presence promised to show him 3 states of Egypt: construction, initiation, and present decay/residue, and that the 3rd state, the one we live in, was not irreverent of the first 2, but merely out of phase. The visitor used an engineering metaphor then, the kind of thing Dennis loved. A circuit that is still present, but whose impedance has changed. There is continuity, it told him, and there is a possibility of re-establishing lower impedance paths. He paused, as if listening again. It said 3I Atlas was both origin and archive, he told me, and that what was left here was a relational instruction. The stones, the water, the sky, they are parts of a machine that responds to resonance. It's not a machine you turn on with a switch. It's a machine you learn to be. That last line, a machine you learn to be, is where the story pauses and where we have to halt for a moment in this telling. Dennis sat back in the diner when he said it, eyes slightly distant, as though the arch of his life had been redirected toward apprenticeship rather than argument. He had been hit and hurt by ridicule, yes, but he had also been given a mission that required him to teach humility and temperance as much as technique. The voice had revealed 3I Atlas, connected it to the Anunnaki line in a way that recontextualized myth as method and offered him the moral burden of stewardship. And then, the night in his apartment, after the voice had made those claims, and after the blue light had faded to ordinary street lamps, the visitor offered him the projection, a conscious slip through time where the 3 layers would be presented. Dennis agreed. He did not leap blindly. He went in with the notebook open and the ethics topmost in his mind. When the room dissolved around him, it did so like a curtain pulled quietly aside. The air thickened, frequency changed, and he felt, as he later described to me, the sensation of being in two bodies at once. One rooted in a small apartment in Tempe, and the other hovering above an Egypt that had once been golden and precise. The first image to arrive was not a person or a building, but sound. A low, sonorous vibration that seemed to be the spine of an entire city. The visitor's voice, now calm and almost pleased, said only two words: observe and remember. He had hardly begun to observe when the floor of reality shifted again, and the light that had been a visitor's shadow separated into three streams, each pulling his attention toward a different time. He remembered the feeling of vertigo, the perceptual tug of being stretched like a thread. He also remembered thinking, even in that moment, about how he would write it down, about how the language he would use later would never quite match the rawness of what he was experiencing. And here the narrative pauses, in the middle of a motion that will break into the three-layered visions, the construction with its levitating arrays, the initiation chambers humming at 432-ish frequencies, and the present-day residue that still thrums under the sand. The alien had revealed where 3I Atlas came from and had begun to show why the pyramids were less monuments and more manuals. Dennis had agreed to be present. The lights gathered. The hum deepened. The visitor, in its precise, avoids any grandiosity voice, prepared him. This is instruction. This is archive. This is invitation. The three streams pulled at him like gravity made visible. One thread shimmered with the cold, precise light of finished stone. Another pulsed warm with the smell of incense and the murmur of chanting. The third sagged heavy with the grit of our present, sand in the teeth, chipped limestone, the hum beneath the soles of tourists' shoes. Dennis described feeling each layer as a body, one lean and machine-like, one lush and human, one weathered and waiting. The visitor's voice threaded through them all, cool and present. Observe and remember, it said. The first stream, the construction, arrived like a schematic unrolled in motion. Dennis saw a plain of sand where, in our maps, the desert had been empty. Men and machines moved in patterns that made geometric sense, not merely workers hauling blocks, but arrays of suspended rigs that did not touch the ground. He used the word cradles later, reluctantly, as if apologizing for the convenience of language. Imagine scaffolding that floated, each member an alignment of crystal facets humming at a tone that pressed at the bones. Imagine copper frames that behaved like antennae, drawing down the sky and focusing it at a point where polished stone became a lens. The capstone, he said, was the heart of the operation. He had sketched it obsessively, a pyramidion not merely of gold or metal, but a composite core filled with crystalline lattice, cavity spaces carved to host ambient sound, and a tiny, perfectly angled aperture at its apex. The voice, when it supplied annotation, translated the image with an engineer's brevity. The capstone is a receiver and a transmitter. It couples with celestial vectors. It is tuned. Tuned to what? I asked him once, leaning over his battered field notebook, my own coffee growing cold. He tapped the sketches. Orion vectors, a star map, a notation beside a number, 432. Then shrugged as an exasperated scientist does when a measurement meets a myth. The visitor said resonance, he answered. It said numbers are poor hands for a living thing. But it offered 432 as an example, a tuning center, not a doctrine. It's a harmonic anchor. Imagine the pyramid as a bell whose strike is measured in the planet's skin, and the capstone as the hammer. In the vision, men placed polished cladding over the core stone, like a skin that could reflect and refract. The cladding, whole and newly smoothed, acted less as decoration and more like a numeric filter. Angles that focused standing waves, faces that directed a low, persistent hum through chambers and into the earth. Levitating arrays, crystalline, precise, cradled large stones and moved them with a patient, indifferent force. The visitor described them neutrally. We shifted mass by altering field gradients. We matched phase. The language was always practical, never boastful. Dennis pinned one fragment in his notebook, an image of a worker laying a small crystal into a recess at the chamber's heart. He traced the man's hands with his finger, like a homicide detective trying to read motive in fingerprints. It was like surgery, he told me, not ritual for the sake of spectacle, but placement for function. The capstone was implanted with elements that matched a profile the visitor called 3i Atlas frequencies, patterns from their archive. The stone was a node, the node linked to a distant reference. When I first heard him speak like that, I felt a wariness. Was this new lore, dressing ancient stones with modern metaphors? He understood the danger. He defensive laughed and corrected himself. Remember, this is how the voice framed it. The visitor said their home, what they called their catalog, was 3i Atlas. It is both coordinate and catalog. The capstone, in the mind the visitor offered me, aligned the monument to those records. As the vision moved, the construction's precision became an act of choreography. Lines were drawn from pyramid apex to stars. Teams synchronized the emplacement of crystal with the lunar cycle. A low, omnipresent tone underpinned it all, a frequency Dennis could not translate into simple sound, but felt like pressure behind the sternum. The voice noted the orchestration with clinical clarity. We encoded for recall. We made a library that could be read by bodies, not only by eyes. The second stream, the Golden Age, breathed life into those chassis. Where the construction layer had been mechanic, the Golden Age was ritualized engineering, ceremonies, initiations, careful attunements stitched into daily life. Priests and initiates moved through temples that functioned as both hospitals and conservatories, places where the living underwent processes that blurred the line between medicine and metamorphosis. Dennis described lying in the cool of a sarcophagus-shaped cavity as if remembering measurements he could not render into numbers. The stone felt like a womb of sound. The cavity's geometry shaped a particular resonance. When tones were applied in sequence, certain sensations uncoiled in the body. Pressure released in the spine, a warmth at the brow, a spark at the base of the skull that ran like a current. The visitor's translation was spare. We tuned memory. We unlocked sequence. Sequence was the word the alien favored over gene when discussing what we might call heredity. The voice framed life as recorded possibility, patterns that, when resonant, could open dormant pathways. It said, there are sequences. They respond to resonance. They are not prophecy, they are capacity. Dennis watched. He said he watched as if from the gallery, while initiates underwent a patterned process. Crystals were placed at the third eye, another at the tailbone, then a sequence of chanting and tone, a reading of carved signs like passwords. The initiate's breathing synchronized with a low-pitched musical interval, and Dennis felt the air in his own lungs match that beat, even though he sat thousands of years and continents away. One of the most arresting images he returned to was the use of mirrors, polished metal arranged in arcs to fold light into glyphs carved shallowly into stone. In the way an optician might focus rays, priests bent light so that the carvings glowed with active pattern. Those glyphs, the visitor said, functioned as keys, code that would, under precise conditions, set in motion a cascade of somatic responses. This was not alchemy in a medieval flourish. Dennis insisted it was a technical protocol dressed in ceremonial form. The ritual language the visitor used surprised him. It spoke of resynchronization, where our myths say rebirth. It explained Kundalini simply as a pathway, an energy channel that, when moved, opened stored information in the body. The pineal, which mystics had long associated with inner sight, was in the visitor's lexicon a receptor, a small organ tuned to certain harmonics. The visitor did not reduce the sacred to the mechanical so much as show their overlap, the way an instrument's shape affects the music it makes. Dennis did not romanticize these rites. He filed away the terror as much as the joy he saw on initiates' faces. The initiations were exacting and could be destabilizing. The visitor warned him over and over about consent and steadiness. "We encode for the willing," it said. "We are not salvagers." This struck him with ethical force. The power to resynchronize was not advertising, it was custody. The third stream, our present, hung low and thick. The monuments were pocked. Cladding had long slid like the dry skin of an old pensioner. Where once polished faces had shone, today stone was dulled and vandalized. Yet underneath the weather and neglect, there were echoes of the original hum. Dennis's own first felt vertigo in a Cairo night, standing near a temple entrance while a reedy tour guide laughed at tourists' credulity. He wrote later, "I felt a thread hum under my feet, and an image, sharp and clean, of concentric circles opening like a pupil." In the present, the system's function had been attenuated by time and human action. Fault lines of neglect and deliberate suppression had raised impedance in the field. Some circuits still lived. Some visitors, rarely and under particular emotional and circumstantial geometry, experienced snippets, déjà vu, a sudden clarity of purpose, a visceral memory of a hand placing a crystal. Dennis met people who said things like, "I suddenly knew a language I had never studied," or "I felt my spine uncoil like a spring." He always reported them as reported. He never claimed causality beyond the subjective. Word spread. That thin ring of followers gathered in online threads and low-lit apartments. Dennis taught with caution. Breath work, meditative attunement, a slow exposure to sound. He insisted on ethical frames. No spectacle, no promise of miracles, no trespass. He wanted people to become attuners who could hold the resonance without projecting dominion upon it. Teaching was less demonstration than apprenticeship, slow, iterative, and heavy with disclaimers. The alien's lessons threaded through all of it. In the vision, it offered Dennis a list, stripped of rhetoric, 5 core truths the visitor insisted were the kernel of their archive's instruction. Dennis wrote them down in the manner of a scientist transcribing a hypothesis, and later muttered their bare phrases in the diner between bites of pie. They were, according to the visitor, not commandments but observations, a primer for those who would read the code. The visitor's voice supplied each line like a matter-of-fact annotation. 1. Consciousness persists. It is not a blink but an ongoing state that can be referenced. We catalog continuities. Memory is deeper than cellular time. 2. Mind and matter are entangled. Intentional patterning can influence form. Not to say that thought alters physics cup and ball style, but that pattern and resonance open possibilities in living systems. 3. Lineage and sequence exist. Beings carry recorded potentials. These are not claims of purity or superiority, but notes on capacity. The visitor called them sequences. 4. Inner power is latent. Activation protocols exist. They are not guaranteed to grant mastery, but to reveal capacity when approached with consent and integrity. 5. Evolution can be design plus emergence, a choreography of circumstance and guidance rather than random drift alone. The alien spoke the list with the same cool clarity it had applied to every other technical detail. Dennis's reaction was not exultation, but a ledger entry. These are the frames we can test in lived practice. He folded them into his lectures with care. He cautioned followers, "These are the voice's claims. They are to be treated as invitations to examine, not as proofs to be flung as banners." One segment of the vision strained him with its emotional intensity. The Sphinx and what the visitor called the Hall of Records. In the construction layer, the Sphinx was not merely a sculptural guardian, but a composite structure with subsurface cavities tuned to large wavelengths. The visitor annotated matter-of-factly. The Sphinx functions as threshold memory. It filters approachers and stores layered registers. Dennis later told me that the Sphinx felt like a sentinel in the way a lighthouse is a sentinel, a structure designed to hold an orientation into the sea of sky. In the Golden Age scenes, priest scholars deposited records into a sealed archive, a vault lined with alloys that dampened decay. They filled it not only with codices, but with things we might categorize as biological records: pressed plant samples, encoded audiovisual sequences, and molecular repositories that the visitor described as seeded sequences. Here, Dennis always said the qualifier, presented as part of the vision. The sense was sober. These were not trophies, they were backups. When the vision touched on Atlantis, on a drowned civilization, the visitor's tone acquired a near-humane regret. "We preserved," it said. "We cataloged lost centers. We sought redundancy." Atlantis, as the visitor framed it to Dennis, was a cautionary footnote, an example of an archive network that endured environmental collapse because records were stored redundantly across systems like planets and monuments. The Hall of Records, therefore, became an interlinked road in a wider lattice the visitor identified as 3I/Atlas. 3I Atlas is not a single star alone, the visitor told him. It is classification, a cluster, a system, a registry. Think of it as how you would title a library. And its location is not a condition we can translate into your maps easily. They called their home 3I Atlas. Their archive network used that designation. Dennis puzzled at that and then smiled with rueful honesty. "It's bureaucratic, right? The cosmic equivalent of a zip code," he said. "But behind the bureaucracy is a method." The method, as the visitor explained in the vision, was to create a planetary-scale interface where encoded sequences, cultural, biological, harmonic, could be read and reactivated by a species that met certain criteria. The criteria, critically, were not technical mastery alone, but an ethical readiness. The visitor emphasized restraint as mechanism. We seeded capacity with moral gates. Without stewardship, we cannot hand the tool. Civilization must show it can hold knowledge without turning it to hoarding. That moral framing is what Dennis said shocked him the most. If the visitor had come to wield power, history would have been written differently. Instead, the image he received was of caretakers who cataloged and waited. They encoded instruction and hid it, in a manner of speaking, inside sand and sound to be found by beings who would treat it with care. This was less imperial gesture than parental caution. Which brings us to the initiation itself. When the vision collapsed for a moment into the king's chamber, and he, Dennis, found himself inside a stone hollow, heart racing, voice steady in his mind. He had consented to the projection. He lay down because the visitor indicated posture and, within the bounds of the vision, placed small gloved objects at precise points along his body. The visitor gave the sequence in 2 sentences. Breathe at the rhythm. Allow the frequencies to find you. What followed was not cinematic fireworks, but a long, calibrated unloosing. Dennis felt vibration like a chorus of insect wings under his skin, a heat at the base of the spine that crawled upward, not painfully but insistently. Images unreeled, hands placing crystal, glyphs passing like a ticker tape, a sound that was more center than tone. He told me the sensation was of memory shifting from latent to accessible, like a hard drive being defragmented and its fragments reassembled into a readable file. He understood that this metaphor was crude, but it was the best he had later. The visitor positioned it with the same restraint. We do not give identity, we fill memory with keys. Dennis felt in that chamber an uncanny intimacy with the planet. He described a moment when the walls seemed to breathe and the hum folded him into a pattern that matched something older than his life. He experienced a release, an ache that was not wholly psychic or bodily, but a layered unburdening. It left him weeping afterward, embarrassed and grateful. Tears surprised him. He had not realized he carried that much accumulation of disbelief and hope in his ribs. When he returned, if returning is the right word, often return felt like a recalibration more than travel. The apartment felt smaller, the air drier, ordinary in a way that was almost comically sharp. The dog Mino whined and patted against his leg, as if to test whether the man who smelled a little of lotus and copper was the same. Dennis sat with the residue for days, running the lexicon of the memory in his head like a man rehearsing a difficult confession. He felt, as he later phrased it, simultaneously proven and terrified. He told me that two things were immediate and unavoidable. First, the need to teach what he had seen without making it a spectacle. Second, the recognition that some authorities would prefer the narrative remain unexamined. He did not mean official conspirators at every turn. He meant the pattern of gatekeeping that governs expertise. Bureaucrats protecting disciplines, people with tenure defending territories. He was careful again. Some institutions, he said, were invested in methods and frameworks that did not accommodate the visitor's taxonomy. That resistance, he accepted, was natural, but he also suspected it had become a kind of deliberate suppression in certain quarters. He began slow public work, blog entries with measured qualifiers, lectures that emphasized testable observation, small gatherings where people learned to use breath and sound as attunement practices rather than as magical shortcuts. A handful of earnest seekers gathered in a back room beneath a tea shop and practiced tone sequences that Dennis insisted were more about attention than about mystical guarantee. He refused to allow anyone to treat the work as a promise of power. "We are training receptivity," he would say. "We are learning not to command." The blog, as the narrative had foretold, became a nexus. People wrote in with their stories. A woman who swore that in a temple she could smell spices long extinct to her palate. A veteran who felt his old aches soften in the temple's corridors, though he could not explain why. A student who dreamed in precise geometric fractals that later showed up tattooed in an obscure manuscript. Dennis posted their letters with care and labels, reported, experienced, claimed by the writer. He wanted to build evidence in the form of patterns of experience, not proclamations. A turning point came on the first real pilgrimage he led. It was not a mass exodus, but a small cluster, 8 people, a translator, 2 local guides, traveling within legal channels and with strict ethical codes. Dennis insisted on permits, on respect for local practice, and on an itinerary that avoided sealed chambers. They stayed in modest guest houses and listened to the desert at night. He was nervous, he acknowledged that. The pilgrimage's purpose, as he put it, was attunement, a slow, gentle practice of opening, listening, and integrating what one encountered. On the first night near a temple, he felt the hum again under his feet as he had in Cairo. This time, however, it was less a startling occurrence and more a harmonic recognition. A woman from the group, soft-voiced, mid-30s, began to weep without explanation as the group circled a small altar. She later described an image of being taught by a woman whose hair was braided with lotus. She could not, post-trip, identify the teacher in earthly terms. She only knew the feeling of being remembered by something that had been waiting. Gradually, over months of careful work, the circle around Dennis, the community, grew. It was a loose network of people who practiced attunement, shared experiences, and held discussions about stewardship. They were a curious mix: an ex-architect, a midwife, a coder who translated patterns into simple scripts to help people practice tone sequences at home, and a retired teacher who kept the group anchored in ethical dialogue. They created rules: no press-only rituals, no ad hoc experiments in sealed chambers, and mandatory discussions around consent. Dennis respected this small but deliberate conservatism. He had seen enough of human hunger to know how easily wonder can become exploitation. Word reached fringe corners, of course. Some websites built myths around him. He received both adulation and vitriol. One day he opened his email to find a veiled threat, language that hinted people with influence would be displeased if he continued to press the matter. He framed it to me as a cautionary anecdote. Gatekeeping sometimes looks cowardly, sometimes like intimidation. He refused to dramatize it. Instead, he turned to the practical. Archive his notes, formalize his teaching protocols, and build redundancy into community safety. The alien's presence did not fade from his life. It kept appearing in small visits, dropping precise images or short declarative training sequences into his consciousness. At moments, the voice would correct his metaphors. Resonance, it said once, is not music as you think of it. It is patterning. Then, almost as if amused, it supplied a simile. Think of it like a city's grid. With the right map, you can make the lights come on. One late-night exchange stands out because it framed the true sting of the alien's message. Dennis had grown impatient with the academic squabbles, with the slow moral readiness of a public that seemed to prefer spectacle to stewardship. "Why show this?" he asked the voice aloud in his apartment, hands splayed on an old table as if propping up the world. The visitor answered with an economy that chilled him. "We catalog and we preserve," it said. "We seed a path. We do not declare, we extend." Their tone, again more clerical than cosmic, made his chest ache. Then the voice added a phrase that haunted him. "The archive tested for humility." It is hard to overstate the ethical dimension that landed there. The visitor had a pragmatic morality embedded in its methods. Knowledge given without readiness is a hazard. The visitor's patience with humanity was not the complacency people ascribe to ancient myths, but an engineered caution. Wait until the relational conditions allow reception without harm. In time, Dennis's work attracted not only seekers, but also skeptics of a different stripe. Some scholars who, intrigued by the pattern of testimonies, wanted to study the experiences themselves rather than the metaphysics they carried. A small interdisciplinary group, an acoustician, a psychologist interested in altered states, an anthropologist with a focus on ritual, agreed to observe meditative sessions Dennis led, not to validate the alien's claims, but to understand the embodied phenomena participants reported. They measured heart rates, sound spectra, and narratively mapped the experiences. Their findings, cautionary and provisional, reported consistent changes in attentional focus and subjective reports of meaning. They did not claim contact with aliens. They claimed the practices altered perception in ways that could be ethically studied. Dennis welcomed this. He liked inquiry. He wanted the work to be robust where it could be robust and humble where it must remain interpretive. That balance kept the community from tipping into cultishness and maintained a tether to method. Resistance remained. The more visible the group became, the more scarce and anxious the whispers grew among institutional figures who preferred the comfort of disciplinary borders. Dennis often said, wry and weary, "Some authorities are guardians of taxonomy, not of truth." He never named names. He understood the power of ambiguity and the cost of accusation. The alien's instruction, meanwhile, grew in specificity. One night, during a visitation that felt particularly urgent, the voice spoke a sequence that felt like a dismissal and an appeal at once. "You will be a bridge," it said. "You will teach restraint. You will preserve the code for those who can hold it." Its cadence was almost parental. This pronouncement did not crown Dennis with messiahship. It saddled him with a duty, not to convert, but to steward. If the visitor framed 3i Atlas as an archive catalog and vector, the final moments of the encounter, what the title promised to reveal, laid out a stitch connecting origin to instruction. In the climactic exchange, the visitor's syntax sharpened. It did not thrill or thunder, it simply supplied a context so cold and precise that Dennis later kept repeating it to test that his memory remained intact. 3i Atlas, the visitor said, is the designation for a cluster of registry systems used by a lineage of observers. They cataloged worlds where capacity could be preserved. Their method is conservative: seed, encode, and wait. They did not claim dominion, they collected continuities. The monuments you call pyramids are devices in this network, nodes that translate local biology into a field readable by the archive. They are an instruction manual encoded in stone and sound. That phrasing, an instruction manual, stung the way simple truth often does. If the pyramids were manuals, then the civilizations that birthed them were curators, not conquerors, organizers of a technique for remembrance and renewal. The visitor's final line, as the vision contracted and the hum eased into the night, summed the moral of Dennis's experience and the shock the title promised. We did not come to possess, we came to entrust. 3i Atlas is the name we gave our registry. It is both source and prompt. We left you an instruction, not a destiny. Dennis came out of the projection exhausted and, paradoxically, lighter. The knowledge that the stones had been left as an invitational archive reframed his life. It was no longer enough to argue. He had to care for reception. He began formalizing his teachings into a curriculum that emphasized inner work, breath, attention to sound, ethical intent before any attempt at attunement. He called the program Attunement and Stewardship. It was intentionally low-tech: guided listening, breath techniques for nervous regulation, and community dialogues about consent and use. The network of seekers coalesced into something like a practice community. They met monthly, compared notes, discussed experiences, and held one another accountable. Their essays and shared reflections, careful, sometimes clumsy, became a small living record. Dennis insisted they archive their experiences. He knew from the voice that archives accumulate power not by seeding grand claims, but by accumulating modest, verifiable testimony. 1 year after the first visitation, a journalist from a small but reputable magazine interviewed him. That piece brought more attention, both flattering and intrusive. Some readers came with cynicism, others with hunger. People sent letters, some asking for proof, others for guidance. He responded to each in his practiced, gentle manner. These are my experiences. If they resonate, work with them in your life. He never told anyone to trespass, never promised miracles. He offered a hard-won ethic: do the inner work, steward the knowledge. Then something unexpected happened. A group of seekers in the community, following Dennis's cautious practices, reported a communal event in a temple courtyard, where, in the hush, a synchronized breathing exercise aligned the group's focus. For them, the experience was not cinematic, but a shared clarity, a near silence of mind where long-held anxieties loosened. The descriptions were careful. People felt center, not transcendence, a communal orientation, not conversion. Dennis archived that night's recordings and transcripts, and then, in an act of prudence, allowed a visiting researcher to analyze the sound spectra. The findings were modest and careful: increased coherence in communal breathing, alignment of heart rate variability among participants, and reported increases in subjective meaning. No cosmic claims were made. The researcher, in academic fashion, called it an intriguing intersection of ritual and physiology. Dennis took the language gratefully. It meant the work had a place in observable scholarship without losing the metaphysical context the visitor had supplied. As months became years, the community matured. They developed practices for safe exploration and an ethics charter that read like a minor liturgy: do not promise outcomes, honor consent, preserve context, resist spectacle. They became careful archives of subjective experience: documents, audio files, drawings, and the occasional shaky video shot on someone's phone, which Dennis often declined to circulate. They had, in the small way a neighborhood initiative does, created a culture of restraint. Dennis aged into the role of teacher not with pomposity, but with the quotidian awkwardness of someone who must keep showing up. He grew more patient. His lectures became shorter and richer in examples. He taught people to listen to low frequencies without trying to control them, to sit with images that rose in them without needing to name them, and to keep a journal where they mapped interior changes the way a gardener marks frost dates. Resistance never fully vanished. Some corners of the internet transformed 3i Atlas into a swaggering myth, an empire of stars. Some commentators simplified the alien into the archetypal trickster. But most people who found Dennis's work did so through slow accretion. A recommended essay, a friend's story, a cautious experiment that yielded a simple change in how one breathed into a stressful moment. Dennis called this the practical miracle, the capacity for attention once trained to alter how one lived. The final revelation the visitor offered, tied explicitly to 3i Atlas and the purpose of the Egyptian network, was not only technological but moral. In a visitation that felt like a closing argument, the voice intoned, "We encoded to invite stewardship. We cataloged not to command, but to preserve possibility. 3i Atlas is a registry of care. Its message," the visitor said plainly, "is not 'you must become us,' but 'you can remember how to hold what matters.'" When I asked Dennis what matters was, he did not reach for poetry. He answered in the pragmatic cadence that had become his armor. Relational integrity, the capacity to hold knowledge without weaponizing it, the humility to steward memory rather than exploit it. He had watched how power degraded people, and he understood how easily wonder becomes currency. That ethical pulse, he said, was the real shock for him. The history people expected, masters descending, handing down technology, would have been simpler and, in a bitter way, more flattering. Instead, the story the visitor offered required people to be worthy of knowledge. That demand unsettled him more than the metaphysical claims. I asked him once whether he believed the visitor was benevolent. He hesitated, then said simply, "It is not for me to judge. My job is to steward what was offered." The visitor's ethics, coded into its methods, were clear. They were restrained. They were cautious. Dennis took them as a template for his own teaching. By the time he returned to public lecturing, again temperate and slow, he had shifted entirely from polemics to teaching restraint. He called the pyramids manuals, but not in the sensationalist sense. They were manuals for being. He emphasized the 5 truths as practical prompts, not catechisms. And he made sure to repeat the final admonition the visitor had pressed on him. Care is the precondition for reception. The pilgrimages continued, but with more structure. The community developed a simple practice called bearing witness, a 3-part ritual of listening, journaling, and mutual reflection meant to ensure experiences were integrated ethically. They asked participants to sign covenants. No photo obsession, no trespass, no purification promises. Their modest safeguards became part of the culture the visitor had insisted was necessary. They acted, in a small way, like the archive's neighborhood caretakers. One afternoon, during a quiet community meeting 2 years into the project, a young member asked the question everyone feared and secretly wanted. If 3i Atlas is an archival registry, is there anywhere to go? Is there an endpoint? Dennis looked at the circles of faces, some weary, some bright, and he inhaled. The visitor's message, he said, was a refusal of easy maps. 3i Atlas, he explained, served as both origin story and instruction. It pointed toward a logic of preservation, not a destination. To him, that meant our task was not to chase a cosmological homeland, but to become a culture that can hold knowledge without seizing it. He described, as he closed the meeting, an image the alien had shown him once, an archive with many drawers, each labeled not by owner but by caretaker, names of places and times with annotations on conduct, consent, and care. The visitor's voice had said, "The record is relational. To access it is to join a pact of responsibility. That pact, Dennis insisted, should guide anyone who feels the pull to this work. There is a certain quiet dignity to a life reoriented towards such stewardship. Dennis, once consumed by the desire to prove, learned to love the slow work of tending. He aged into the humility of someone who knows that knowledge without care is a hazard. He watched students, some of them skeptical at first, become careful apprentices. He watched the community archive grow, pages, recordings, sketches, and an ethic register. He watched people claim small transformations, less reactivity, more attention, a stitched-together sense of purpose that did not depend on cosmic revelation, but on the practice of listening. In the end, the alien's revelation about where 3i Atlas came from was less a single astonishing fact than a reframe. The builders were not overlords, but archivists. The monuments were not commands, but invitations. The code they left was an ethic as much as a technology. The real message, the one that had shocked and steadied Dennis, was deceptively simple. We are given more than we can steward. Our responsibility is to learn how to hold it. So what does one do with such a story? Dennis, never fond of flamboyant calls to arms, offered practical steps. Cultivate attention. Practice audio and breath attunement. Join a community bound by ethics. Document experiences carefully and with humility. He placed a small set of resources, papers, measured protocols, and a short ebook titled Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, Practical Attunement and Stewardship, in the pinned comment of his blog and in the community's resource folder. He did so not as a claim of authority, but as a pragmatic guide for those willing to do the inner work. The visitor, in one last visit that felt like an exhale, concluded with a phrase that Dennis wrote in his notebook like a benediction. The archive waits for readiness. The code is not a shortcut, but a reminder. We left an instruction, not a destiny. The stones will hold until you learn to hold them. At the end of everything, when the dust of rumor has settled and the heat of controversy cools, what remains is a simple ethical query. Can a culture learn to steward the knowledge it is given? Dennis's life moved from argument to apprenticeship, and that movement, quiet and stubborn, felt to him like salvation. He had been given the burden and the chance to hand it forward. If this story resonates with you, if the idea of encoded instruction, of 3i/Atlas as archive and origin stirs a tug inside, consider this an invitation. There are resources in the pinned comment to help begin attunement practices and to join conversations about stewardship. If you feel called, start with breath. Slow down, listen to low frequencies, journal what rises, and approach with humility. And if, at some late night in a place far from pyramids, you find yourself breathing and suddenly feel a low hum under your feet, remember the visitor's admonition. Tend the knowledge, do not weaponize it. The archive is not a prize, it is a pact. Have you ever felt a déjà vu about Egypt, or experienced sudden clarity in a place of stone? Tell us below, carefully, honestly, so the archive grows not in spectacle, but in responsible memory. If you want to explore more careful stories like Dennis's, download Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence in the pinned comment, and consider subscribing for our weekly gatherings where we practice listening and stewardship together.